want to welcome everyone here to this third and final session of this town meeting on foreign affairs, co-sponsored by the State Department and the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. I noticed that this is a large turnout. I noticed that there were very good questions to the last speaker, and I think it's typical of Baltimore that we have a name for a large turnout of informed people, and that produces good speakers. And these two things feed on each other, and I think we're getting a name in Washington as one of the leading forums for informed discussion of foreign affairs. This has been a very high-quality meeting so far, and our speaker, our keynote speaker, final speaker, is a great catch for the Council. Winston Lord, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, is both one of the nation's leading experts on China and one of the key players in policy making in the Clinton administration. And it isn't often that you get someone who combines those two attributes in any administration. The first thing that I researched when I found I was going to do this was to try to find out what an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs does or is concerned with. So at the Sun, where I work, I looked up everything we've written about him since he was nominated by President Clinton for this position on January 19th, 1993. And there were a great many stories, news stories, opinion pieces, and so on. And the topics they were concerned with included Indonesia's human rights record on East Timor, whether to pre-position U.S. weapons in Thailand, the link, if any, between most favored nation trading status and human rights in China, the cooperation of Vietnam in providing information about U.S. servicemen missing in action in the Vietnam War, the nuclear weapons development or crisis in North Korea, the opening of diplomatic relations with Vietnam, the question of military aid to Cambodia's new regime, which is dealing with the Khmer Rouge, the linkage between Singapore's desire to host the first World Trade Organization meeting next year and its caning of a young American citizen, human rights in China, barriers or alleged barriers to trade in Japan, trade relations with Vietnam, Secretary Lord's visit to Hanoi, President Clinton's relations with U.S. veterans organizations, China's reported sale of missile technology to Pakistan. And there were a number of other stories concerning East Asia which you can think of which don't pop up here. There was another story in December of '93 that his name was on a short list being considered for promotion to Deputy Secretary of State. He didn't get it. Then there was a story in some other publications, not ours, quite reputable publications in spring of this year about his imminent departure as a possible, from the State Department, as a possible fall guy for criticism of the China policy. That didn't happen either, so I'm very glad the Baltimore Sun was scooped on that one. After Yale and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Winston Lord entered the Foreign Service in 1961. And after 6 years at the State Department in Washington and Geneva, he moved to the Defense Department as a policy planner in international security affairs, and then to the staff of the National Security Council. And this is at the start of the Nixon administration. And after a year on that staff, he became Special Assistant to the National Security Advisor. This is 1970, and here's where it gets interesting. To refresh your memory or your reading of history, this was the opening of relations with China. The one episode in American diplomacy that has produced a full-blown and critically acclaimed opera, Nixon in China. The National Security's advisor to whom he was special assistant was Henry Kissinger, and the great project was the opening of relations with China. You will have recalled or read about Kissinger's secret mission to China. That was Lord's and Kissinger's secret mission to China. And I guess he was what international bureaucrats call a Sherpa. The Sherpas in the Himalayas are the guides who precede the famous climbers up the mountain and say, this way and watch your step. In the start of the second Nixon term, after when you'll recall that Kissinger moved to be Secretary of State, and Winston Lord went to the State Department, back to the State Department, as chief of the policy planning staff. And I understand the policy planning staff to be the in-house think tank of the State Department that tries to deal with the question, well, what about next month or next decade? And he served in that role through 1976 into 77. When the Carter administration came in, Winston Lord left government and he became president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. This is what's called landing on your feet. And it was in that role that some of you will remember he came to address this council. And it was in that role that he came to be known as to the public as an expert on China. And it was helped that he's married to another one. And some of you have read the works of Betty Bow Lord, the novelist and journalist and human rights campaigner. In 1985, he was called back into government by President Reagan to be ambassador to China. And in that role, he achieved a good deal of prominence, and we all started to know his name. After 4 very eventful years in China, he went back into private life, and he became known from various think tanks and other chairmanships and so on as a critic of the Bush administration policy on China, and in particular, the relationship in the Bush administration between trading and human rights. He emerged as one of the younger foreign policy advisors to the nominee Bill Clinton running for president. And when Clinton became president, he nominated Winston Lord to be Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Now, I want to remind you of some of those problems and nations I ticked off, because basically what we're talking about is the shape of the world in the next half century. That's what diplomacy with East Asia is about. He's on the hot seat in policy. Much of what I think he's going to talk about is controversy, is what people praise or don't praise President Clinton for. And he's certainly one of the most important speakers we have this year, and it's my great privilege to present the Honorable Winston Lord.
Thank you for that lavish introduction. It reminds me of introductions for one of my former bosses. You mentioned Henry Kissinger. As you know, his ego is slightly out of control. And I always used to like to get up and introduce him and saying, ladies and gentlemen, I now want to introduce to you a man who is clearly a legend in his own mind. Now, there were some inaccuracies in your otherwise splendid introduction. You had a couple of oxymorons. China expert is an oxymoron. Thinking in the State Department is an oxymoron. A couple of other mistakes, if you don't mind my saying so, is you got close to the truth when you said I was a Sherpa on a secret trip to China in July 1971. And in a way, you were correct. You said I preceded him this way and so on. Most people think that Kissinger was the first American official to go to China after 22 years of separation from Beijing during the Cold War, from 1949 when the Communists took over to July 1971. Well, actually, I was the first. What happened was we were flying from Islamabad to Beijing on a Pakistani Air Force plane, the president's plane, Pakistanis up front. I was in the back of the plane with Henry Kissinger. But as we got to the Chinese border, I ran to the front of the plane, so I was the first one in the China. In any event, it's a great pleasure to be back here again. I echo all that you said about the growth and the reputation of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Relations. I'm very pleased to be here, as I know my colleagues who preceded me are pleased to be here. Jim Dobbins I know well, and I know he spoke in Haiti. Darrell Johnson, one of our top career Foreign Service officers, has just preceded me, which is unfortunate for me. I hate to follow a tough act. Darrell and I worked together in Beijing. I always used to think he was pretty intelligent and had sound judgment, but if he's got nothing better to do on a beautiful evening in Baltimore than stay around and hear me speak, I'm beginning to wonder about his priorities, but I do appreciate it very much indeed. I do, of course, want to get to your questions, which are always the most interesting part, but let me try to sketch in brushstrokes, given the time I have, the broad contours of the Asia-Pacific region, Speaker, and I do mean to thank you for your generous introduction, suggested by encapsulating it in the broad framework of a Pacific community. And the very first question that would come up, by the way, it's interesting that we're meeting on December 7th, which reminds us of a bleaker time in our history with the Pacific and how far we've come and how far the nations of that region, including Japan, have come since that date. But the question before the House this holiday season is there a Pacific community or is it a myth? And I would answer to that, yes, Virginia and Maryland and Washington, there is a Pacific community. Or more precisely, one will emerge over time. Now, of course, it's a huge and diverse region. We cannot force definitions or forfeit differences. Building a community will take patience and persistence and a collective effort. Indeed, it'll take longer than getting the U.S. Air Arena ready to play basketball or getting the Redskins back in the Super Bowl. And we will never see a tight community like the smaller, more homogeneous European community. But I think the contours of commonality are appearing. The revolution in technology is eroding borders. Revolution in transportation is shrinking distances. The revolution in telecommunications is leaping barriers. Intra-Asia-Pacific trade is more intense than intra-European trade. Business people are spurring regional integration. Diplomats are spawning regional institutions. These are realities that lend weight to the President's vision of a new Pacific community of shared prosperity, security, and freedom. Now let me try to fill in some of these contours. In January 1993, the Clinton administration faced head-on the first post-Cold War agenda that any administration had to face from its beginning, with all its opportunities and ambiguities. I was honored to be nominated by the President to serve this administration. As already mentioned, I also served President Reagan, Republicans and Democrats, which proves one of two things. Either I'm indispensable or I have absolutely no principles. Frankly, I don't see why those are mutually exclusive, one reality was clear back in January '93, and that is we think that the greatest, and we still do, the greatest promise lay across the Pacific Ocean. And I think with this audience, I need not rehearse all the reasons for that. It's got the most dynamic economies and therefore is most relevant to the President's domestic agenda, particularly economic and the promotion of exports and jobs. The fact that our trade across the Pacific is more than 50% greater than our trade across the Atlantic. The next 6 years, just to give you a sense of the economic dynamism, if you look at infrastructure projects alone in this region, it is the equivalent of building 15 Santa Monica freeways a day. I think that's good news, but in any event, to give you some sense of the scale and the opportunities out there. We also have enduring security interests. We fought 3 wars the past half-century, but I think it's fair to say that right now and back a couple of years ago, we have the most stable set of relations among the major powers, perhaps in this entire century. And there's been some heartening trends toward freedom, fueled by satellites and fax machines and by the universal principle that woman does not live by rice alone. And here at home, there's been a shift in our population toward the Pacific and an enrichment of our population with Asian Americans, with their particular excellence in academia and entrepreneurship and many other sectors of our society. Now, naturally, as we looked across the Pacific, we saw daunting challenges as well. And on a conceptual level, at least 3 that echoed the global context of this post-Cold War world. First, the fact that we had a historical legacy of Eurocentrism in our foreign policy. And I want to make a couple things clear. First, I think it was justified. Most of our Americans, for most of our history, came from Europe. Our trade flows were across there, the security ties. And indeed, Europe remains vitally important, including the area that Dow Johnson was talking about. So this is in no way to suggest that our interests in Europe are not huge. But the point is that we believe that our interests in Asia and Pacific are growing and will be even greater in the coming century, as our introducer suggested. So our response to this conceptual challenge was to take advantage of the calendar of the first year of the Clinton administration, the lucky opportunity that there was a 1 in 7 chance that the G7 industrial nations annual meeting would be in Asia, namely Tokyo. So the President's first overseas trip, first time for a long time for any president, was to the Asia-Pacific region, where he laid out his concepts of economic security and democratic dimensions of a Pacific community. And there was a 1 out of 15 chance that the United States would be host to this new regional economic organization we just read about in recent weeks of APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And he took advantage of that to lift it from the ministerial level up to the leaders level. And in the course of these and speeches and other activities, including maintaining our force levels in Asia and emphasizing our economic interests, I think managed to convey to the American people the stake we had in this region and convey to our Asian friends the fact that we're staying on in our own self-interest. The second conceptual challenge from the beginning was, how do you define American leadership in this post-Cold War world? How much unilateral leadership, how much multilateral? Whether you talk about Haiti, which you've been talking about, or the tragedy in Bosnia and so on, this issue is going to be coming up continually, and not just in security or peacekeeping terms. And now our response in this region has been that, of course, American leadership remains absolutely indispensable, but increasingly we'll have to include the building of consensus and working with others. By definition, shaping a Pacific community is a collective undertaking. The third conceptual challenge was the hierarchy of American interests. Now, we've traditionally pursued economic and security and human rights and other interests in our foreign policy. But during the Cold War, you had a rather clear hierarchy, namely security generally came first. If we had a trade or economic problem with Japan, for example, and the Secretaries of Commerce and Treasury came to the White House with it, Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the National Security Advisor, would say, get lost with your silly economic problems. We have a Cold War rivalry with a geopolitical nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union. We can't afford to be worried about economic issues with our good friends and allies. So let's forget about your problems. Or, for example, if we were dealing with an unsavory regime, if it was anti-communist and was an ally in the Cold War, we tended to downplay the human rights concerns. I'm not criticizing. These are objective statements. In fact, in most cases, I think our priorities were entirely correct. But those days, of course, are over. Economics is increasingly important for obvious reasons on our international agenda. But other objectives, whether it's security, human rights, the environment, drugs, many issues, are also extremely important. And it's much more difficult to figure out the hierarchy and the trade-off than the more clearly defined world of the Cold War. Now, we think that over the long term, promoting security, prosperity, and democracy reinforce each other, and we are going to pursue and are pursuing all three. But there's no question that in the short term, you often have to face some difficult trade-offs. It's a balancing act in the near term, but with a conviction that for the long term, these goals reinforce each other. It's a balancing act, whether it's trying to choose in specific situations between creating American jobs and freeing foreign prisoners, or welcoming American ships and planes to a port or city where at the same time they're caning American teenagers and censoring American professors. It's balancing off a bold economic vision for a region and bold human rights demonstrators on embassy grounds, heeding the missing in action from a war and healing the wounds of that war, population explosion and population regimentation, heroin and human rights, the list goes on. So in sum, given what I've just laid out conceptually, the administration has set out to move Asia-Pacific higher on our international agenda, to both lead and work with others to build a Pacific community, and in so doing to balance our various interests. Now, during the first half of the Clinton first term, whether it's the first and only or the first of two, I'll leave to you and to others. But we think there's been sort of three phases one can sort of look at as we look back on this. In fact, one is reminded by the two misleading articles that were mentioned about my ups and downs. We've had ups and downs in Asia-Pacific policy as well. I think phase one sort of culminated about a year ago with this APEC summit meeting in Seattle, and that we do think by then, through a variety of means, as I've mentioned, that we had brought home to both our Asian American audiences our stakes in this region. I don't think our policy was swimming along as beautifully as it was portrayed at the time, and many people with a conventional wisdom was that the Clinton administration is floundering in foreign policy, but at least they know what they're doing in the Asia-Pacific. That was, I think, unfair to the overall policy and probably too generous to the Asia-Pacific policy. But the circle came around, and in phase two, which I would say reached a crescendo last spring, it looked like Asia-Pacific policy was in deep trouble. The Japan trade talks had broken off. We had this debate on China most favored nation treatment. The Korean nuclear agreement talks had broken off. Our human rights debate with the region, or parts of the region, were reaching high decibel levels. Now, I said at the time that I felt about the situation in the Asia-Pacific, because many good things were going on. I said I felt somewhat about this the way Mark Twain felt about Wagner's music. It's not as bad as it sounds. Some of these problems required patience and persistence, and I think we've seen, as I'll shortly recount, that this has paid off. You don't define success just by harmony all the time if you're getting at difficult problems. And meanwhile, we were moving ahead and building regional economic structures like APEC and some regional security structures as well. We were moving ahead with Vietnam. Cambodia was making progress. and we were solidifying our ties with Australia and improving them with New Zealand, just to take a few examples. Now, we're in sort of phase 3 now, and once again, I think we've regained momentum in the Asia-Pacific area. There's been a convergence of some good news. I might say that's been true of the President's foreign policy, with a major exception, of course, of Bosnia, which has drowned out the recent momentum of Haiti, which has gone better than anyone thought could, the deployment to Kuwait, which preempted aggression again, probably by Saddam Hussein, contributions to the Northern Ireland situation, the Middle East peace process, and a North Korean nuclear agreement. But we have momentum with the North Korean nuclear agreement. We've reached a series of trade agreements, not fundamental and major, but nevertheless encouraging, with Japan. We've moved ahead with comprehensive engagement and high-level visits and progress in certain areas and problems in others, of course, with China. I think we have a more modulated and mutually respectful dialogue with human rights with the region as a whole. The President and the Secretary of State have just come back. I was with them on, I think, a very successful trip, including the centerpiece, the Bogor APEC declaration of moving toward free trade and open trade and investment in the region by the year 2020. And finally, in Bangkok in July and August, there was the first meeting at this level and this comprehensiveness of what we call the ASEAN Regional Forum. Includes 18 countries with the new members of Vietnam, Russia, China, and some others joining Japan, ourselves, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Southeast Asian nations. The beginning of a security dialogue that in many ways parallels the economic institution and progress of APEC. So how then is the Clinton administration doing a midterm? And in my remaining time, let me give you a brisk rundown of some of the major issues. I'll let you make out the overall report card. I think in fairness, on most issues, you'd have to probably mark down incomplete. While we've struggled in some areas, however, and while some very tough tests lie ahead, I believe unsurprisingly that the overall report card should get a cum laude and not a cum lousy. Let me begin with the economic dimension. And in each of these three areas of economics and security and democracy, I'll sort of quickly remind you of the challenges we faced and where we've come. And back in January 1993, two major objectives were to open up lucrative, often protectionist Asian markets with stubborn trade deficits, especially with Japan and China, and indeed the only countries we had a surplus with in the region were Australia and Brunei. And the second objective was to ensure America's place in the Pacific community, not see the world divide up into trading blocs with, say, an Asian-only grouping as promoted by Malaysia. Now, obviously, both these challenges represent many years of work, if not decades. And we've approached them on four levels. First, on a domestic front, to get our own house in order. American businesses are leaner and meaner. The American economy is in very good shape. I think anybody would acknowledge that. The deficit has come way down. We've relaxed export controls. We've promoted exports and jobs, including in the Foreign Service, not just our commercial agencies, as a high priority for our foreign policy. And I can say from experience, as one has been in many administrations, I am struck when I look at talking points for our top officials for key meetings with foreigners, how much of them now are dominated by business and commercial and economic interests compared to the 70s and earlier, and even some of the 80s, where it would be almost all security and political. On the bilateral front, we've engaged Japan in framework talks. We frankly lost the public relations battle. Somehow, at least in Asia, Japan was regarded as sort of the free trade and we were for managed trade. When you think of Japan's protectionist market, for us to come out that way in public relations is a real feat of incompetence. The fact is it's not true. We're trying to open that market for everyone, and I can get into greater detail later if you like. I am pleased with the agreements in September on top of other agreements on specific sectors. The fact that they are moving ahead on macroeconomic stimulus of their economy, the specific agreements that we've reached, the fact that Japan is moving toward reform, however episodically in terms of change of governments, toward more attention to the consumer and competing political parties. All of that's going to open up Japan over the long run. So the question is, will our domestic audience, including the Congress, give us the time with these deficits, which will persist for some time, to continue working at opening up this market? And bilaterally with China, we've engaged in a series of discussions on the economic front, intellectual property rights. They want to get into GATT. We want them in, but they've got to get in on quality grounds and not on political grounds, textiles and others. And we've had formal dialogues with many other countries on economics like Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand. So domestic, get your house in order, bilateral negotiations, but the latter can often be contentious and tough. So we're increasingly trying to emphasize multilateral approaches to trade in Asia-Pacific as elsewhere. I've already mentioned APEC, where with the President lifting this to the leaders level in Seattle, I think they sort of sketched a vision for the future. What you just saw a couple of weeks ago in Indonesia was the direction we wish to take that, namely freer trade in the region by the year 2020 for all countries and 2010 for some others. And this is a major significance, and I would like to get into this in a question and answer period. I can't do it justice now. It's a political commitment. There's a lot of details, and next year when we meet in Japan, we're going to have to reach a blueprint of how we start moving toward this ambitious goal. But business people start making decisions in advance. When is a target date? That's been the experience elsewhere. This is a very meaningful goal that's in the American interest. There are some who have said that this vision is not enough, that you need pragmatic building blocks to help trade and investment in the region. That is also happening, whether it's standardizing customs or whether it's investment principles and many others. So we both have the political commitment for the destination, but on a pragmatic day-to-day basis, we're integrating the region and strengthening our economic position there. APEC is in our interest because it promotes prosperity in the region. It helps to anchor the U.S. in the region, not only economically, but in many other ways. And it's a very important initiative of the President. And it does mean a blending of our leadership, on the one hand, like we did in Seattle, but supporting Indonesia this year and Japan next year in a consensus organization as we move forward and grapple with this challenge of defining leadership in the post-Cold War world. The final part of our four-part attack on our economic problems that I mentioned is global, the GATT. Delighted with the votes last week. APEC is a building block to promote GATT, not a trading block. It gets out in front, helped to stimulate the completion of the Uruguay round last year and get Europe's attention so that they came along. And I believe that the Summit of the Americas, which you'll be seeing in a few days on Western Hemisphere trade, is going to reach a bolder outcome as a result of the bold outcome reached in Indonesia. So this is sort of competitive liberalization, and it's very, very promising indeed. And last year when we had NAFTA passed, then the APEC Summit and the Uruguay round, we called it a triple play. We have another one this fall with the Summit of the Americas following on the GATT vote and the APEC meetings in Indonesia. I think we ought to get away from triple play. That's 3 outs. We ought to say hat trick or something. It's 3 goals, but in any event, you get the point. And I think the international economic architecture that the President has taken the lead in promoting is some of the most far-reaching since Bretton Woods, shortly after World War II. Moving then on to security challenges, we had both immediate and over-the-horizon challenges in January 1993. The immediate ones were Cambodia and Korea. Over the horizon were the potential problems in the future, whether it's non-proliferation or regional conflicts, a revived Middle Kingdom or a remilitarized Japan or a resurgent Russia. On Cambodia, you keep your fingers crossed, of course. You never take the Khmer Rouge for granted, but who would have thought 3 or 4 years ago that thanks to the efforts above all of the heroic Cambodian people, but also the international community and the U.S. policy played a strong supporting role, that you would go from the killing fields to a situation where the violence is very modest and sporadic, where all outside influence, most of it not very helpful, has been removed, whether it was Vietnam or China's aid to the Khmer Rouge or Thailand not sealing its border. There's still some leakage there, but they're making a very major effort and they've improved their effort. That almost 400,000 refugees would go back from Thailand to Cambodia, that you would have free and fair elections in which over 90% of the people registered and vote despite intimidation and violence, that you'd end up with a non-communist government, at least dominated by them, coalition government cooperating against the Khmer Rouge. We will continue to support Cambodia. It's an example of successful UN peacekeeping at a time that the UN gets some bad marks elsewhere. Korea, I suspect you want to get into more detail again in the question and answer session. We thought from the beginning this was a major strategic importance in terms of stability in Northeast Asia, in terms of the future of that peninsula, and in terms of non-proliferation efforts generally. So we, from the very beginning, were prepared to go to any lengths diplomatically and, if necessary, in other ways, to bring this to a conclusion and to deprive North Korea of a menacing nuclear future. There are tough choices, but I felt about and I feel about our policy there, in which I'm very comfortable, like I did in terms of the options we used to present when I was on the NSC staff under Nixon that you mentioned. He didn't want one recommendation, he wanted sort of alternatives, so we used to give him usually three. The first one would be unconditional surrender, the second one would be nuclear war, and the third would be continue present policy. I think the choices with respect to Korea were, if I could sort of simplify them a little bit, letting the North Koreans have dozens, if not hundreds, of nuclear weapons, running the risk of a conventional war that would be bloodier than the war in the 1950s, or pursuing administration policy. It's not quite that simple. The fact is we were willing to go to sanctions, got close to them with all the dangers involved in that because we felt so strongly about this issue. You will see this agreement, as it should be, closely scrutinized and debated in coming weeks, particularly with the new Congress. If I can sum it up quickly, then we will spend more time later on it. Think of it in terms of the past, the present, and future nuclear capabilities of the North Koreans. What we did was say we're willing, although not happy, to wait a few years to discover the past, namely whether they have nuclear weapons, and the most they would have is one, and that's it. Would be discovered in a few years at radioactive waste sites that can't produce plutonium and not going anywhere, and they're under tight surveillance. Wait a few years for that, and after all, North Korea said throughout the negotiations until the final weeks that they would never allow the kind of inspections needed to determine that. In exchange for immediately freezing their entire program, and it's being implemented as we speak, where the IAEA has had full cooperation and has determined that the entire program has been frozen, which was capable almost immediately of producing dozens of bombs a year, and maybe hundreds by the early part of the next century. That's the present. And then in the future, all of this gets dismantled when they get substitute energy sources. So we think a few years to find out about one bomb is worth freezing dozens and dismantling the capability for hundreds. Furthermore, we are not rewarding North Korea. They're going way beyond their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, by the way, have now come back into with all the inspections that are required. There's nothing that says they can't reprocess their plutonium. There's nothing that says that they have to send their spent fuel out of the country. And above all, there's nothing that says they have to dismantle all these reactors and refueling and reprocessing plants. They're doing all that. That is why they're getting substitute energy in return. So it's hardly a reward. This is a rather major effort that we've required them to undertake. In any event, every country in the world, some with some reservations on commercial or other grounds, has supported this. We think it's a very good agreement indeed. With respect to the longer-term regional security challenges, we've tried to address these both bilaterally and through regional security dialogue. Bilaterally with Japan, you will see great emphasis this year as we reaffirm our security alliance. Trade frictions have gotten the attention, but we've managed to insulate those from our security and other interests with Japan. With China, we have comprehensive engagement, including with their military. I was with Secretary Perry there recently, as well as other high-level and working-level visits to advance our China relationship across a broad front, making progress in some areas where we can, whether it's cooperation on Korea and Cambodia, a recent agreement on missile proliferation, some progress on trade, good cooperation on drugs and alien smuggling, and a potential working together on the environment. So there's quite a bit of good news with China. There's also some bad news. Human rights on the whole, although there's been some movement, export of arms, and many economic issues. but above all in the security area, to try to draw them into the international community in these bilateral talks and then in the regional talks I'll mention in a minute. With Russia, we have, and you heard a great deal about this already, a promotion of reform there to integrate them into the World Committee and thus take care of that security problem as best we can. And with Vietnam, our highest priority remains getting information on the missing in action. We're making good progress on talks and opening up liaison offices, which should happen quite soon. And we'll have to see whether we can move ahead on our relations in the coming year or two. We believe that this advancement has promoted cooperation by the Vietnamese on our MIA, so you don't have to choose between that overriding criterion and our economic and geopolitical interests. More generally, with respect to security, we've opened up this dialogue that I've already mentioned with these major countries. It's preemptive diplomacy. It's taking advantage of relatively stable environment now to get countries who have been historical or are potential antagonists around the same table, talking to each other, conveying intentions, whether it's about military budgets or territorial claims, erasing misperceptions, perhaps building confidence over time. And we think this has great promise, but obviously it's going to have to take some time. There are other security dialogues that we carry on of a smaller, more intense nature as well. Finally, the promotion of freedom. Again, as you look back to January 1993, Asia, like the world, was moving in many respects toward more accountable governments, but obviously there were some key regimes that were caught in a time warp of political repression. Now, frankly, this is the most complex challenge of all, even more so than the security and economic ones that I mentioned. It most visibly and vividly raises these issues that I mentioned earlier of hierarchy of interest. What order do you put your interest as you carry out your various goals? And it's on issues where we frankly get the least international support. Even those who believe in the same values we do are not as apt to run some risk with their other interests, including lucrative contracts, in order to promote those values. So the Japanese and the Europeans will let us take the heat while they take the contracts. Now, there's a false perception, and this is very important, that it's the United States or the West versus an Asian monolith. But when observers suggest that Jiang Zemin, or more plausibly Lee Kuan Yew, speaks for Asian values, I say tell that to the Japanese and the Filipinos and the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Thai, and tell that to the Cambodian voters who crossed minefields or the Mongolian voters who crossed deserts to vote. Our message to the Asians is not arrogant. We're not on an American crusade. And again, keep in mind that many Asians agree with us, and I've mentioned some of those countries where they do. Of course, each country must trace its own path depending on its cultural and historical context. And of course, we have problems here at home. So we're trying to strike that tone, but we do believe there are some universal human rights in the UN Charter that countries are obligated to, and there's no way under any system of values to justify torture, just to take one example. And above all, we try to appeal to the country's self-interest. We believe that in an age of information and technology, there is no way you can develop an economy over the long run without opening up that economy politically as well as economically. In an age of faxes and computers and satellites, you've got to have a free flow of information. Where you have to debate complex issues of economic reform, you've got to have competing political universes. If you want to attract investment, you've got to have the rule of law. If you don't believe me, ask McDonald's, which is getting kicked out of a very nice site in the middle of Beijing because the rule of law is not fully established there yet. If you want to attack corruption, you've got to have a free press, which I'm sure my moderator would agree with. So you maybe get away for a while with some political authoritarianism and open economics, but it won't last for long. So we try to appeal to self-interest. Finally, to Americans, as we promote freedom, we point out, of course, Americans want some idealism as well as pragmatism in their foreign policy, and they want their government to promote values as well as hard rock interests. But there's a very pragmatic dimension to promoting freedom as well, and that is it promotes other interests in the short term as well as the long term. It may be a cliche, but it's true that open democracies and societies do not attack each other, so you're promoting security. They do not promote terrorism. They do not produce refugees. They do not drive groups into armed opposition. They make better trading partners. They're more apt to pay attention to the environment. So we have some very solid, concrete interests in freer societies beyond our idealism. I don't have time to go into great detail now about our various human rights debates. China, of course, is the major one. I've mentioned that we're trying to get at that problem no longer through linkage to trade, which was an instrument that gave us considerable leverage, but it was also a blunt instrument with some disadvantages. The President is pursuing human rights in other ways with China now, but we're also pursuing our other interests with this comprehensive engagement that I've mentioned. There is a danger that in Asia or here that observers may think, because of delinking MFN from China, balancing our interests, economic and human rights with Indonesia, for example, concentrating on MIAs, although we do talk to Vietnam as well about human rights, and our recent, somewhat misunderstood dialogue with Burma, where we've offered two visions of the future, either worse relations if they continue their repression, or better relations if they move ahead in some of these areas, including the release of the Nobel Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. There is a danger that maybe there's a perception we are downgrading human rights. We are making some course corrections. We are approaching it, in some cases, with different tactics, but the President's commitment is as solid as ever, and there's no other country in the world that comes close to giving it the attention that we do. And as for those on the other side of the House who argue that political repression is needed for stability, quote unquote, I would refer you to a chronicle of 3rd century BC of China about a brutal king who silenced dissenters and it brought disaster upon him. This chronicle said, "Stopping up the mouths of the people is more dangerous than stopping up a river. When a river is blocked and then breaks through, many persons are bound to be injured, and it is the same with the people. Therefore, one who desires to control a river will leave an opening where the water can be drawn off, and one who would govern the people should do likewise, encouraging them to speak." And some were engaged in a complex, controversial balancing act, but I think we can take heart that thanks to technology and self-interest and human nature, that history is on the side of freedom. Finally, crowding onto our foreign policy agenda in this region as around the world are some newer issues that transcend borders and ideologies and require multilateral solutions. With half the world's population and the pressure on resources, clearly the environment is front and center in the Asia-Pacific region. And indeed, this pressure on resources is clouding the prospects for future dynamic growth in this region. And there are many other problems that threaten the economies as well as the security and the quality of life for the people of Asia, even though it is by far the most successful economic story in the world, and I think will continue. I'm basically optimistic, but whether it's the flow of narcotics or the flow of refugees, the spread of crime or the spread of AIDS, and most ominously the degradation of the environment, from coal burning in China to the depletion of forests in Southeast Asia to the depletion of fish in the South Pacific to traffic jams everywhere that make California expressways look like, well, expressways. So we're just beginning to tackle these problems. On a bilateral front, we have an agenda on these issues with Japan and with Russia, and we are going to move out on one with China. On the regional front, we've suggested the relevance of some of these problems, particularly the environment, to APEC. On the global front, I think the administration has been very strong on the environment, whether it's at Rio, whether it's the Cairo World Population Conference, biodiversity, comprehensive test ban, global warming, preserving coral reefs. I think this is a rather strong record in this area. In conclusion, I would point out, of course, that foreign policy begins at home, and just a month ago, our foundation shook in the election, or did they? Will we be able to continue foreign policy in a bipartisan way? I believe this question has come up with previous speakers. During their recent Asia-Pacific swings, both the President and Secretary Christopher stressed the bipartisan continuity of American foreign policy, and one could take some hope from the strong votes promoting and ratifying the GATT trade agreements. And moreover, Republicans traditionally are for a robust American role abroad and for freer trade. But I'm not naive, and we're not naive. Surely the next 2 years are going to see some rancor and resistance. There's going to be more controversy. Certainly the administration will try to deal as constructive with Republicans, and I happen to be a Republican for that matter, as possible. And so there are going to be some problems. I think we can expect, for example, grilling on Korea, grating on Taiwan, and grandstanding on Vietnam. But basically, I think our Asian-Pacific policy has done well through the years because it's had more continuity than we've seen in other parts of the world, more of a joining together of Republicans and Democrats. And I think we can therefore tap a broad consensus on some of our major goals, including the partnership with Japan and its centrality in our policy, comprehensive engagement with China, maintenance of our security ties in the region, promotion of American jobs, and commitment to universal values. In sum, I believe we can continue to shape with others an emerging Pacific community that is richer, safer, cleaner, and freer. Thank you very much.
Secretary Lord has consented to take questions and graciously allowed a good 15 or so minutes in which to do it. There are microphones on either aisle. I have been instructed to repeat questions of people who don't speak clearly into the microphone. And let me tell you, you don't want this to happen. So if people will stand behind the microphones, I'll recognize one side and then the other.
If that happens, let me redo the question so I can make it a little easier.
Okay, the lady in red.
Yes, good evening, Ambassador Lord. My question has to do with the American middle class and the success and expansion of it since the end of World War II, with the increase in wages, the opportunities for people to educate their children and have adequate health care. My concern, while agreeing with what you're saying about anchoring ourselves in East Asia and having opportunities for being included in those economies, is for the American worker. And what I don't hear anybody in any administration for a very long time talk about is how are we going to protect the American worker? How is the American worker going to compete with the workers of Asia whose lifestyle and living standards have been very different and much lower in many cases?
It's a very fair question. It's been at the heart of the debate, not only with Asia-Pacific trade, but the NAFTA debate and the recent GATT debate. Now, I think we've got to be honest. There are going to be some American workers who are going to have trouble for the very reasons you cite, and open markets on both sides are going to lose out because of lower wages in other regions. And we have a moral, not to mention political obligation, it seems to me, to cushion that, to make a transition, to retrain wherever possible. But some people are going to be hurt, and it's unfortunate. But the point is that many more will gain great advantages. And time and again that's been shown. It's been shown already in NAFTA, despite the fears that we heard raised. There's no question that our exports are going up. On balance, jobs are going up. So you have to look at the net result. And one of the reasons precisely why the President is emphasizing the Asia-Pacific region is for the American worker. There's 2.6 million jobs right now that are supported by exports to Asia. We believe that over the coming several years that another almost 2 million can be provided as we look ahead. It is the most dynamic region, and it's precisely to help the American workers and middle class that we are promoting our economic interests out there. And APEC, for example, most of the countries in APEC, the developing countries, have tariffs ranging about 30 to 40%. You add on non-tariff barriers, probably a protection value of almost half, 50%. Americans' average tariff is 3%. So we'll be coming down to much less than opening up those markets. That will help American workers. That's the main answer to your question, but I'd be the first to admit that some are going to be put out of work. Now, the other point is that export jobs, and again, they outnumber the jobs lost through imports, contrary to conventional wisdom, are generally high-tech and high-income jobs. And therefore, they're good jobs, not just more jobs. So we think it's clearly in our interest, and obviously the Senate and the House do as well.
On my left.
Yes, I have two distinct questions. Do you think changes in China's economic policy will move it toward democracy is my first question. And the second question is about Hong Kong. What is the U.S. foreign and economic policy of Hong Kong when it's finally absorbed to China in 1997?
Again, good questions. Can't do them justice. We want to get to as many as possible. But certainly the opening to the world and the economic reforms and this decentralization and the pluralism that is taking place because of economic changes moving toward the market in China is loosening up that society. Despite the repression we've seen since Tiananmen Square 5 years ago, there's no question that some of it is lip service repression, particularly get away from Beijing. People are somewhat looser about some of the political controls. That trend, I think, will continue. I think China is committed in its own self-interest to move ahead and reform. However, great abuses persist. We're doing what we can to encourage political openness in the meantime, because we don't want to wait for the inexorable trend of history. We don't believe, as I've already mentioned, that you can have political repression and economic growth for very long. We've made very little progress since the MFN decision, to be honest. We're going to continue at it. We do have a very intensive dialogue that the Chinese have agreed to resume. We have their agreement to try to have other Red Cross visits, if possible, talk about VOA jamming. They did release some dissidents, but others are being rounded up, and repression persists there. It's frankly a difficult period. They're in a succession phase, looking to post-Deng Xiaoping leadership. And as you want to jockey for position and power in China, you may not want to look like you're overly flexible on sensitive domestic issues. So this complicates our objectives. But I am optimistic about the future in China. Not only these economic processes working their way out, but I think the Chinese leaders in the future will see it's in their own self-interest to loosen up. But it won't be necessarily overnight, and it won't be a straight line projection. On Hong Kong, the Chinese have a great self-interest in making Hong Kong work, both the tremendous economic importance, I wouldn't need to elaborate, don't have time, and because as they look to their relationship with Taiwan, they know that if they mess up Hong Kong, Taiwan is going to be put off as well. So they have the self-interest of making it work, but again, they are torn with this desire to maintain political control even as they open up economically. And we would like to think that the Chinese will recognize that such elements as the rule of law and a free press and some accountable government is important for the investment climate, the general attitudes in Hong Kong, and therefore in China's own self-interest. They have not yet reached that conclusion. Much will depend on what kind of government sits in Beijing in the coming years. Meanwhile, we do raise Hong Kong. We recognize it's between the Hong Kong people, the British, and the Chinese above all, and we don't get in the middle of that. But we made it clear that we think it's in China's own self-interest to promote these processes I've mentioned, and we underline our very strong commercial and humanitarian interests in Hong Kong.
I want to thank Secretary Lord for such a splendid talk and such candid answers to our questions.